Hello, everyone. Welcome to another lecture, which comes after quite a long time. This lecture will be on John Milton's Areopagitica, and I hope we shall learn a lot in this small lecture. If I cannot finish what I have to finish within the time that I have right now, I will make several parts of it. So, without further ado, let's begin and let's learn. So you see, John Milton's Areopagitica was first published in 1644. This is a very passionate prose work which argues against pre publication censorship. It was written in response to the licensing order of 1643. What is the licensing order? We will discuss this. For the time being, let us understand in very brief what is the licensing order. The licensing order required the authors to seek government approval before publishing their works. All right. So now the title refers to Areopagus, or the High Council of Ancient Athens, which symbolized free debate and rational discourse in the Athenian world. Now, Milton, who was a Puritan and a supporter of the parliamentary cause in the English Civil War, was deeply troubled by the restrictions and the intellectual uh, clutches that were imposed during his time. So in Areopagitica, he represents a very well structured and a very eloquent argument advocating for an open marketplace of ideas where truth can be tested and strengthened via debate. As simple as that. So his treatise is regarded as one of the most influential defenses of free speech in history, and it influenced later thinkers like John Stuart Mill and others in the modern democratic principles. All right. So now, if I go on into the political, social, and literary background of Areopagitica, we will see that it was written in a very turbulent period in the English history, and it shaped, and in turn, it was shaped by several political upheavals, religious conflicts, and literary transformations. Therefore, it is quintessential for us to understand the background of the text itself. All right. So let's first deal with the political background of Areopagitica. If we look at the political background of Areopagitica, we will see that the background consists of the English Civil War and the press censorship. Now, the English Civil War took place between 1642 and 1651. Excuse me. Sorry. Milton wrote Areopagitica in the midst of the English Civil War, which was a conflict between King Charles I and the Parliament over who gets to govern, who gets the religious authority. All right. So the war arose from several tensions. There were several parties which were the stakeholders of the government at that time, and these parties were basically uh, fighting amongst themselves, to be very, very honest. Okay, now what are these parties? One of the parties was the Cavaliers or the Royalists. They supported King Charles I, and they believed in the divine rights of kingship and the absolute monarchy. That is, the king is the representative of God on earth, and therefore he has the absolute right of monarchy. The second group was the Roundheads or the parliamentarians, who were led by none other than Oliver Cromwell, and they sought to limit the king's power and to establish a more representative government which was led by the people. Okay. Now, Milton was a staunch supporter of the parliamentarians, and he saw censorship as a tool of tyranny. So he feared that the parliament, if it adopted several oppressive measures like pre publication censorship, that would betray the very commitment to liberty that the Parliament had. So, now we will talk about the licensing order of 1643. What was this? What was this licensing order of 1643? And how did it impact? And how does it impact our understanding of the text itself? So, look, one of the immediate causes for Milton's Areopagitica was the licensing order of 1643, which reinstated the pre publication censorship. That is, the law required that all the books to be approved by official censors before publication. And Milton strongly opposed these measures taken by the government, and he compared it to the Catholic Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorium, that is, a list of banned books. So he argued that such restrictions would lead to intellectual stagnation. Okay, let me quote a section from the text itself so that we can understand. He's saying in Areopagitica, for books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. So Milton believed that books were living entities. They are capable of shaping minds and societies. And pre publication censorship, he argued, suffocated the intellectual growth, and this was an affront to the human reason. Now, this is more or less the political background. Now, let us go into the social background of the religious conflicts, of the role of press during that time. So during this time, first and foremost, we have the rise of religious dissent. This 17th century was a time of intense religious conflict in England. And this had multiple factions. The reason was that multiple factions were competing for control over the English religious soil. So Anglicans were there who were supporters of the Church of England. There were the Puritans, the radicals who wanted further reforms into religion. And then there were the Catholics who were oppressed under the English Protestant rule. And finally, there were the dissenters, the various Protestant sects who were seeking a sort of religious freedom during this time. Now, Milton, who was a Puritan himself, was deeply committed to religious liberty. And he saw censorship as a means of very powerful institutions to suppress the dissenting views. That is, they were trying to create one general norm, and everybody has to conform to that norm. And unless you conform to that norm, your words will not be heard. Now, this is dangerous in a parliamentary democracy, so as to say. So Milton argued that truth could only emerge through open debate, which is a belief which is central to the Protestantism's emphasis on individual interpretation of the Bible. Okay, so how does he talk about this in the Areopagitica? And he says, a man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believe things only because his pastor says so, or the assembly so determines, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. So basically, he is asserting that blind acceptance and indoctrination without questioning or without understanding undermines true faith in reality. And then, obviously, there was the explosion of print culture during that time. So, the early 17th century witnessed a dramatic increase in printing, which led to greater literacy and public engagement in political and religious debates and ideas of the time. And the press literally became a battleground for competing ideologies. So during this time, we have the pamphlet wars. So writers who used pamphlets to spread political and religious views, and they often attacked each other, their opponents, very viciously. Then there were religious tracts, and Milton himself wrote quite a few. So Protestant and Catholic writers published arguments on theology and governance, and basically they were at each other's throats. As simple as that. And then there were political treaties. The political treatises during the Civil War period led to the increased political discourse of the times, with texts debating ideas such as monarchy, democracy, individual rights, and so on and so forth. And during such a time, Milton saw pre publication licensing as a way for the elites to control this vibrant intellectual environment, preventing the ordinary citizens from accessing diverse perspectives and of voicing their own ideas. And you see, there is a very interesting literary background to this as well. You see, Milton was deeply influenced by the Renaissance humanism. So his work was deeply shaped by this. This was a movement which emphasized the value of classical learning once again. And simultaneously, it also propagated individual reasoning and intellectual freedom. And Milton was severely influenced by several uh, exponents of the Renaissance and post Renaissance Europe. People like Erasmus, who championed free inquiry in religion, people like Montaigne, who emphasized skepticism and the need for open debate, people like Francis Bacon, who advocated for empirical search of truth. And Milton believed that human reason was a divine gift and that suppressing books was an insult to God's plan for intellectual and moral development. So you see, Milton's work is developed on classical models like the Areopagus, the Athenian democracy, and so on and so forth. So the title Areopagitica, as I have already told you, it refers to Areopagus, or the High Court of ancient Athens, so as to say, which symbolized free speech and reasoned debate. And Milton admired classical and Roman models of open discourse, particularly of Socrates, of Cicero, of Demosthenes, amongst others. Socrates defended free expression and was executed for questioning authority. Cicero advocated for the free exchange of ideas in politics. Demosthenes defended democratic principles through public oratory. And by invoking these diverse classical traditions, Milton positioned himself within a long intellectual lineage, a tradition that valued free speech as an essential ingredient of a just society. So look, he writes in Areopagitica. I am not making this up. I am substantiating from the text itself. So he says about truth. Let her means truth. So let her and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. And this reflects Milton's belief that truth can only emerge through competition with falsehood, much like the philosophical debates of ancient Greece. And you see, Milton had great, rather, he was greatly influenced by Protestant reformative writing as well. Reformers like Martin Luther, reformers like John Calvin. Luther defied Catholic censorship to translate the Bible into German. Calvin promoted theological debates, and Milton saw Areopagitica as a part of this tradition, defending the right to read, think, and publish freely. So, this is a very interesting premise of the text. Now, what happens in the text before I go into the discussion? So, we have had some understanding of the text, some background of the text. Now, we shall try to understand what is actually happening in the text. Now, look, the text opens with a sort of an appeal to the parliament. So Milton begins by addressing the English parliament, expressing his respect for their role in securing the liberty. And he acknowledges their efforts in fighting tyranny, but he warns that pre publication censorship is itself a form of oppression. He argues that true liberty cannot exist without the freedom to express one's thoughts openly. He says, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties." And this opening sets the stage for his subsequent arguments that censorship contradicts the very principles of democracy and intellectual progress that they have sworn to protect. Next, he moves on to the value of books and knowledge. Excuse me. Milton compares books to living beings. He emphasizes the idea that they contain the vital spirits of their authors. And he argues that by destroying books, what you are doing? He says that destroying books is akin to killing reason itself. And he then extends this argument, claiming that even bad books serve a purpose. They help individuals exercise their judgment by distinguishing truth from falsehood. So he says a good book is the precious lifeblood of a master spirit, embalmed and treasured up on purpose to a life beyond life. And this idea aligns with the Renaissance humanism, which valued knowledge as the key personal and societal growth. This was the key to personal and societal growth. Then he talks a little bit about the biblical and historical perspective on censorship. So he invokes both religious and historical arguments to oppose the very idea of censorship itself. He refers to biblical stories, particularly of Adam and Eve, to illustrate that knowledge of both good and evil is essential to human development. And he also examines the historical failures of censorship, noting that ancient Athens and Rome flourished without it. And he criticizes the Catholic Church's Index Librorum Prohibitorum, that is, the list of prohibited books, arguing that England should not follow such repressive practices. He says, if we think to regulate printing, thereby to rectify manners, we must regulate all recreations and pastimes, all that is delightful to man. So Milton's tone is very sarcastic here. It highlights the absurdity of controlling literature to enforce morality. Then he talks a little bit about the flaws of the licensing system. He argues that the licensing order is impractical and therefore it is counterproductive. He points out several flaws. First of all, he talks about how the censors are fallible. So, if books require approval, who ensures that the people who are giving the approval, the censors themselves, are competent judges of truth? Secondly, look, censorship weakens intellectual growth. Societies that allow free debate progress very intellectually, while those societies that suppress ideas remain stagnant. This reminds me of a small poem. The poem is perhaps by Tagore, if I'm not wrong. If I'm not wrong, I don't remember who wrote the poem. We read it early in our school days. The poem was in Bengali, so I'll talk about it in Bengali and then I'll translate. The poem goes something like this: যে নদী হারায় গতি চলিতে না পারে, অজস্র শৈবাল দাম বাঁধে আসি তারে, যে জাতি জীবন হারা অচল অসার, পদে পদে বাঁধে তারে জীর্ণ লোকাচার. So the river which has lost its flow is always stagnated by stray weed or stray algae. stray algae. So the river which has lost its flow is always stagnated by stray algae, and the nation which has lost its life force and has become stagnated, has become numbed, that nation is always caught up in sort of public observances and so on and so forth. There is much of show and pomp and showing off, so as to say, a lot of public display in that society, in that civilization, but actually no progress is being made over there. And then Milton talks about suppression of ideas, which leads to greater rebellion. So he warns that the attempt to control thoughts only make people more determined to challenge the authority. So he writes himself, truth and understanding are not such wares as to be monopolized and traded in by tickets and statutes. So here Milton likens truth to a free flowing force that should not be confined by certain legal restrictions. And then he talks about the marketplace of ideas and the triumph of truth. This is one of Milton's most influential arguments, and it is that truth will always emerge victorious in an open contest with falsehood. So he asserts that truth does not need government protection because it is inherently stronger than false ideas. So Milton says, let her and falsehood grapple, whoever knew truth put to the verse in a free and open encounter. So the concept became fundamental and foundational to later liberal political philosophy, particularly in discussions of free speech and in discussions of democracy. And look, Milton here becomes an advocate of a well placed trust in the people's judgment. So he concludes with a direct appeal to the parliament, urging them to trust the English people, and he argues that the citizens should be allowed to read and to evaluate the texts for themselves rather than having the state dictate what they can or cannot read and what they can or cannot access. So he writes, a nation not slow and dull, but of quick, ingenious, and piercing spirit, acute to invent, subtle and sinewy to discourse, not beneath the reach of any point, the highest that human capacity can soar to. So look, this highlights Milton's belief in human reason and the intellectual strength of the English people. So this is basically a sort of a gist of what happens in Areopagitica. Now, if we look at the ideas that are being propagated in Areopagitica, we shall see that this is a very interesting text. But before we do that, let us talk a little bit about the title of the text, the Areopagitica. As we have already discussed, this is taken from Areopagus, which was a historical council like a high court today in ancient Athens, and it carries a profound classical and rhetorical connotations, a series of profound classical and rhetorical connotations. And Milton deliberately invokes this association to lend authority, historical depth, and philosophical weight to his argument. Now, the Areopagus was an Athenian symbol of free speech and justice. Areopagus was a prominent hill in Athens that served as the meeting place for an elite judicial and legislative council. And this body, known as the Areopagites, was responsible for overseeing the law, morality, and public discourse of the time. So, in classical antiquity, so as to say, Areopagus was associated with justice and wise governance because it was composed of experienced Athenian statesmen, and this was considered as a guardian body of the Athenian laws. Secondly, it was responsible for the freedom of speech, or what is called parrhesia, in the Athenian democracy. The Areopagus played a role in the legal and political debates, and it fostered an environment where reason and argumentation were valued. Thirdly, it serves as a basis for the classical oratory. So many Greek orators, including Demosthenes and Isocrates, delivered speeches that defended political freedom and ethical governance before the Areopagus itself. So, by naming his word Areopagitica, Milton aligns himself to this Greek tradition of public debate and intellectual liberty. And he suggests that parliaments should function as a rational, deliberative body, much like the Areopagus itself, rather than imposing oppressive censorship laws on the people. And therefore, he makes a very classical invocation. He says, it was from out of the rind of one apple tested that the knowledge of good and evil, as two twins cleaving together, leaped forth into the world. And perhaps this is that doom which Adam fell into of knowing good and evil, that is to say, of knowing good by evil. So here Milton echoes the classical notion of knowledge arises through experience and debate. I know good as good because I know evil as evil. So I they are binaries which both I must know. So this is a principle which is upheld in the Athenian tradition of free discourse. Secondly, Areopagitica can be seen as a classical oration because Milton does not present Areopagitica as a treatise or a pamphlet but as a formal oration in the style of the ancient Greek and Roman rhetoric. The structure of the text itself mirrors that of the classical speeches, incorporating an exordium, which is like an introduction. So it establishes the significance of free speech, a narratio, that is the statement of the facts, which outlines the history and dangers of censorship. Then we have the third part, which is a confirmatio, that is arguments in favors of free speech. So here Milton cites examples from history, from religion, from philosophy. Then we have a peroratio, that is a conclusion, which makes a final emotional appeal for intellectual freedom. And Milton's choice of the title, therefore, signals not only to his debt to classical democratic ideas, but also to his skill in rhetorical persuasion, demonstrating uh, that his plea for free speech is based on reason and historical precedent rather than mere polemics. So, look, Milton talks about this in a very interesting way. So he says, let truth and falsehood grapple. So let her and falsehood, that is truth and falsehood, grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the verse in a free and open encounter. This quote I have already given. This reflects the Socratic and the Athenian belief that truth emerges from rigorous debate and not from censorship or suppression. So then comes the idea of the Areopagitica and the Areopagiticos of Isocrates. So Milton's title directly alludes to Isocrates' speech, Areopagiticos, which took place around 355 BCE, in which the Greek orator called for the restoration of moral and political integrity in Athens. Isocrates lamented the decline of Athenian democracy and urged the city to return to its noble traditions of wise governance and intellectual freedom. And Milton, writing amidst political and religious turmoil in the 17th century England, makes a similar appeal to the parliament that rather than restricting the press, it should uphold the principles of rational governance, free inquiry, and civic virtue. The same ideals that defined the earlier Areopagus. So Milton's Athenian ideal is something like this, which he writes in the text itself. For this is not the liberty which we can hope, that no grievance ever should arise in the commonwealth, that let no man in this world expect, but when complaints are freely heard, deeply considered, and speedily reformed, then is the utmost bound of civil liberty obtained that wise men look for. So here Milton is basically echoing Isocrates' belief that true liberty does not mean the absence of conflict, but rather the open discussion of ideas in pursuit of justice and wisdom. And then there are certain political and religious implications of the title as well, because the choice of the title is deeply political and theological. It challenges the parliamentarian authority because by referencing the Areopagus, Milton implies that the English parliament should function as an arbiter of reason and justice and not as a censoring body that suppresses debate. And this is a very Protestant reformative argument because Milton's defense of free speech aligns with the Protestant theology, which emphasizes individual interpretation of scripture over institutional control. And just as the early Protestants resisted the Catholic Church's censorship of the Bible, Milton resists the parliamentarian attempt to control the printed works. So he talks about religious tyranny in the text. He says, I cannot praise a fugitive and cloistered virtue, unexercised and unbreathed, that never sallies out and sees her adversary, but slinks out of the race where that immortal garland is to be run for, not without dust and heat. So, this metaphor suggests that true virtue or truth itself can only be strengthened through struggle and engagement and not by retreating into any forms of dogma or censorship. So, the title forms, it functions as a symbol of intellectual freedom because it number one it aligns with the work of the classical traditions of free speech of democracy, particularly the rhetorical legacies of Socrates, Demosthenes, Cicero, and Isocrates. Secondly, it frames his text as a formal oration rather than as a polemical pamphlet. Thirdly, it critiques the parliamentarian licensing order by implying a truly just government would embrace open discussion and not thrust censorship. And fourthly and finally, it connects his argument to the Protestant and Reformation ideals. So ultimately, Areopagitica becomes not just a defense of free speech, but a manifesto for the intellectual and moral vitality of society. So now, let us look at the themes that Milton explores in this text itself. Okay, so now there are various themes which we have already talked about, but let me identify them for you so that it becomes easier for us to talk about them when we are asked about this. Now, the central theme of the text would be without a second thought The central theme would be freedom of speech and expression. So, it is a defense of free speech, and Milton contends that individuals must have the liberty to express their thoughts without prior restraint, and he argues that censorship stifles intellectual and cultural progress. And he famously declares in the text, "Give me the liberty to know, to utter, to argue, and to argue freely according to conscience above all liberties." So Milton's argument is based on the belief that restricting the press undermines the very foundations of knowledge itself. It is a challenge to epistemology. He insists that a society's intellectual vitality depends on open discussion, and that suppressing ideas weakens its moral and political fabric. So his stance basically anticipates the later Enlightenment thinkers like John Stuart Mill, uh, specifically Stuart Mill, because he wrote on liberty in 1859, and in that text he expanded upon the idea that truth can only be tested through a free debate. And therefore, you see, William Riley Parker notes that Milton's view of free speech is deeply intertwined with his Protestant beliefs. So, Parker is writing, Milton's argument for free expression is fundamentally theological, grounded in his conviction that reason is a divine gift that enables individuals to distinguish between good and evil. However, there are other notions as well. For example, Stanley Fish points out that Milton's advocacy for free speech is not absolute. He excludes Catholic writings from his defense. And Fish shows that his concept of liberty was constrained by his religious biases as well. So, this is also one idea. Uh, the nature of truth and knowledge is another theme. So, Milton presents a very powerful argument that truth is not static, but it must be tested in the marketplace of ideas. So, he asserts that truth will always triumph over falsehood in a fair contest. And I have given that one quote. I am continuously referring to that one quote, but I can't help it. That quote is one of the central blood vessels of the text itself. So let her, that is truth, and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. So this notion, which is often referred to as the marketplace of ideas, became a foundational principle of modern democracy. And Milton suggests that banning books out of fear of falsehood is misguided because individuals grow intellectually and morally by engaging with different viewpoints. If something is false, let people read and decide for themselves that it is false or it is truth. For all purposes, most of the literature that we have, that is false, because that is a story, that is a made up concocted thing. But does that mean that literature is always bad? That's not the point. No? So therefore, Milton says, let the people read and let them decide. Who are you to barge in and decide for the people? And John Alvis argues that Milton's vision of truth therefore becomes very deeply optimistic. So Alvis writes, Milton envisions a world where truth is self-evident and needs only freedom to emerge victorious, a view that underestimates the power of manipulation and ideological control. So, in contrast, again, we have Noam Chomsky. So, Chomsky critiques the idea that truth naturally prevails in free discourse. So, he notes that powerful institutions can distort information, and that can make it very difficult for the public to discern reality. And we have seen the extremes of it in texts like 1984. In texts like Fahrenheit 451 and so on and so forth. So this suggests that while Milton's argument is very idealistic, it might not fully account for modern challenges like propaganda and misinformation, so as to say. And the third issue that Milton raises is censorship as tyranny. So he equates censorship with political and religious tyranny. He condemns the licensing order as an oppressive measure, comparing it to the Index Librorum Prohibitorum of the Church, the Catholic Church, which banned books which were deemed to be heretical. So he warns that once censorship is allowed, it will expand beyond books into other areas of life. So he says, if we think to regulate printing, thereby to rectify manners, we must regulate all recreations and pastimes, all that is delightful to man. So this is a very slippery slope of censorship. And Milton suggests that intellectual freedom is inseparable from political freedom. So, Christopher Hill highlights the political implications of Milton's argument by saying that Milton saw censorship as a symptom of broader authoritarian tendencies. He feared that restricting books would lead to the suppression of religious and political dissent. However, there are other critics who have argued that Milton's attack on censorship is very selective. Critics like David Lowenstein, they point out that while Areopagitica is a very bold defense of free speech, Milton later supported suppressing royalist literature when he served under Oliver Cromwell. So this is a very historical way of reading Milton as well. Then we have another issue, which is the moral responsibility of readers. Milton argues that exposure to diverse ideas strengthens the individual's intellectual core by allowing them to develop their judgment. He challenges the notion that shielding people from harmful ideas will make them morally pure. So that is not going to happen. So he says, a man may be a heretic in the truth, and if he believe things only because his pastor says so or the assembly so determines, without knowing other reason, though his belief be true, yet the very truth he holds becomes his heresy. So unless my knowledge is challenged by some form of critical engagement, it becomes blind acceptance, and it is not my knowledge, it is the data that I have received. So, just that. So, T.S. Eliot writes very beautifully. He writes, where is the where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost in information? So we have 10,000 informations. Just open your Google Chrome, just open your Facebook, your X, your Instagram, so much of information. Does that really constitute knowledge? Does that really constitute conviction? Does that really constitute wisdom? That is the question. Are we in the post wisdom age? I really don't know. That is food for thought, maybe. But in any case, Annabel Patterson suggests that this is a very radical argument by Milton. So Patterson writes, by shifting moral responsibility from institutions to individuals, Milton challenges the paternalistic logic of censorship and calls for an active thinking citizenry. So instead of the government spoon feeding you the ideas that it believes which is good for you as a father figure, why don't you find out for yourself what is good for yourself? So, in a modern context, in a present day context, however, critics like Cass Sunstein, they argue that Milton underestimates the ability of misinformation to manipulate public opinion, making it difficult for individuals to make informed choices. Many of us have seen the COVID era. We have seen what a free net pack and a lot of free time can make people do. All the nonsense that was there on the social media, we have seen what are the dangers of the individual choice and the idea of a thinking citizenry, so as to say. So this is also one concern. Look, if I am dealing with a text, I'm dealing with the positives as well as the negatives. I'm talking about Milton as a thinker of the ages, and I'm also talking about a Milton who is a thinker of his age only. If I don't do both of them, then I'm lying to you. As simple as that. Our times are different, his times were different. But from his times, he could anticipate so many problems of our times as well. That is where his greatness lies. But the fact that our times have different sorts of problems, so kind of that same but different, that kind of a problem still exists. That also tells us that uh, while literature creates a semblance of life, it creates a very similitude of life. It is never life itself. So that is one aspect as well. And we must, as students of literature, accept this part. We cannot quite say that we shall turn a blind eye to this. That would be very wrong. Now comes the role of government in intellectual life. You see, Milton's argument is not at all against all forms of regulation. He's not saying that the government should not regulate anything, because he accepts that dangerous and seditious writings can be punished after publication. If I am writing something which is seditious, which is harmful for the fabric of the nation, I can be punished later after publication. But Milton insists that pre publication censorship is unjust because it assumes guilt before the wrongdoing occurs. He says, for books are not absolutely dead things, but do contain a potency of life in them to be as active as that soul was whose progeny they are. So if I'm writing a book, my book reflects my convictions as well. My books reflect my ideas as well, my soul as well. Therefore, Milton draws a distinction between legal consequences of harmful speech and writing and the prior restraint imposed by licensing laws. Imagine if in my mind I think that okay, I'm going to commit a crime. If I'm just thinking about it, I'm not acting on anything. Okay, say somebody has, say, I'll just give an example. Say somebody maybe has one chocolate bar. I don't have a chocolate bar. I want to have that chocolate bar. I'm thinking this in my mind that okay, I want to have that chocolate bar. I want to have that chocolate bar. So in effect, I'm thinking about theft. Legally, I'm thinking about theft. As simple as that. Hmm? So I have a guilty conscience. Okay. But the problem is, until I act on that, until I raise my hand, reach out to that chocolate bar, maybe take it when the other person was not looking, how can you say that I have done anything? Say, I'm thinking about the chocolate bar while you are eating that. And you finished it, we chatted, and you left. And I never even mentioned the chocolate bar. Would you yourself have any idea that yes, this sir was thinking about stealing my chocolate bar, etc., etc.? Obviously, no. So, but Milton says if you uh, impose pre-publication licensing, then what happens is that you are punishing me for thinking about that chocolate bar. That is not how the law should work. Now, you see, political theorist Quentin Skinner highlights Milton's nuanced position by suggesting that Milton does not reject all regulation of speech. Rather, he insists on due process, arguing that ideas should be judged only after they have been expressed. So, this anticipates the modern legal distinction between free speech and incitement to violence in speech. And this is the principle which is enshrined in many democratic legal systems. So, you see, this is a very interesting text and an intellectual exercise, and I have referred to many criticisms, many critiques. So I'll talk about the books as well. When I have mentioned John Alvin, the book is Milton's Rhetoric and Freedom of Speech. Noam Chomsky, I have referred to. Now, this is Media Control, the Spectacular Achievements of Propaganda. This is by Seven Stories Press, published in 2002. Stanley Fish, Versions of Anti-Liberalism, Milton and the Law, Harvard. Christopher Hill, Milton and the English Revolution. David Lowenstein, I have mentioned, that is Milton and Liberty. William Riley Parker, I have mentioned, that is Milton, a biography. I have mentioned Annabel Patterson, the name of the book is Censorship and Interpretation, The Conditions of Writing and Reading in Early Modern England. This is published by University of Wisconsin. I have mentioned Quentin Skinner, the name of the book is Liberty Before Liberalism. This is by Cambridge Publications. I have mentioned Cass Sunstein, that is Republic.com 2.0, which was published by the Princeton University Press in 2007. So, this brings us to our conclusion of Areopagitica. I hope you have, if not enjoyed, learned a little about the text itself. Because many students tell me that, sir, Areopagitica is very boring, Areopagitica is very boring. But in any case, I hope we have learned the text, we have learned the issues, we are capable enough of dealing with the text, of grappling with the text itself. So, on this note, let us end our discussion. Thank you so much for being such a patient audience and hope to see you again very soon. Thank you. Have a good day and goodbye.